I was standing in the middle of a crowded charity gala in my Valentino gown and $500 heels, watching a woman never met verbally destroy the only man who'd made me feel human in 3 years, and when she laughed, that cruel, sharp laugh, and said, "Look at you, you're pathetic, you couldn't even afford to take me to Applebee's when we were married, and now you're what? A bartender at rich people's parties?" Something inside me snapped, and I walked across that marble floor in front of 200 of the city's elite, and I said, "Excuse me," and she turned to me, this perfectly maintained blonde in her late 20s, with veneers and extensions and a dress that cost more than his rent, and she said, "Can I help you?" And I said, "Yes, you can. You can stop talking to my boyfriend like that," and the entire room went silent because I was Diane Montgomery, 53-year-old widow of tech billionaire Robert Montgomery, CEO of Montgomery Industries, with a net worth of $470 million, and I just called a 25-year-old bartender my boyfriend in front of everyone who mattered in this city, and his ex-wife's face went white, and she said, "Your boyfriend?" And I said, "Yes, my boyfriend, and if you ever speak to him like that again, you'll be hearing from my lawyers." And before I tell you how I ended up falling in love with a man young enough to be my son and how he saved me when I thought I was past saving, hit subscribe right now and tell me in the comments where you're watching from, because this story is about what happens when everything you built your life on crumbles and the person who catches you is someone the world says you shouldn't want. But let me take you back 7 months before that gala. Back to the day I met Liam, because you need to understand how broken I was to understand how much I needed him 7 months earlier. I was sitting in my corner office on the 48th floor of the building that bore my dead husband's name, and I was signing divorce papers, except they weren't my divorce papers. They were for my head of legal, Maria, who just discovered her husband was cheating, and she was crying in my office, and I was handing her tissues and telling her it would be okay, even though I knew it wouldn't be okay, not really, because it had been 3 years since Robert died of a heart attack at 58, and I still wasn't okay. I still woke up reaching for him. I still sat 2 places at the table. Sometimes I still heard his voice in the hallway, and the loneliness was eating me alive from the inside out. And everyone kept telling me I should date, I should move on, I should find someone new, but I was 53 years old, and I'd been with Robert since I was 22, and I didn't know how to be with anyone else, didn't know how to start, didn't know if I even wanted to. And the company, Robert's company, our company, was thriving. We'd just closed a deal worth $600 million, but I felt hollow, like I was going through motions, like I was playing a role in someone else's life. And that night, I left the office at midnight like I always did, and I was exhausted, and I stopped at this small bar 3 blocks from my building, a place I'd never been before. And I went in and sat at the corner of the bar and ordered Scotch neat, and the bartender was this young guy, mid-20s, with dark hair that fell over his eyes and forearms covered in tattoos, and he poured my drink and said, "Rough day." And I said, "You could say that." And he said, "I'm Liam." And I said, "Diane." And he said, "Nice to meet you, Diane." And there was something about the way he said my name, not Mrs. Montgomery, not ma'am, just Diane, like I was a person, not a title. And I said, "How old are you?" And he said, 25. And I said, "You're young." And he said, "And you're tired." And I said, "How can you tell?" And he said, "I can see it. You look like you're carrying something heavy." And I said, "That's oddly perceptive for a bartender." And he smiled and said, "See everything. People think we're furniture, but we're really therapists who serve alcohol." And I almost laughed. And I said, "Well, then what's your diagnosis?" And he said, "You're successful, you're powerful, but you're lonely, and you don't know how to fix it, because the tools that made you successful don't work on loneliness." And I stared at him, because he'd just described my entire existence in one sentence. And I said, "Are you always this direct with customers?" And he said, "No, but you looked like you needed someone to be honest with you." And I said, "Maybe I did." And we talked for 2 hours about everything and nothing. He told me he'd been divorced for 6 months, that his ex-wife Melissa had left him for a real estate developer with money and a BMW, and she'd made it clear that Liam would never be enough, that he was a loser who'd peaked in high school. And he told me this without self-pity, just stated it like a fact. And I told him about Robert, about how I'd lost him and how I was running his company, but I felt like an imposter. And he said, "Why do you feel like an imposter? You built that company too." And I said, "How do you know?" And he said, "Because nobody gets to where you are by accident." And I said, "You're very wise for 25. And he said, "Pain makes you wise." And I've had plenty of that. And when I left that night, I gave him a $200 tip. And he said, "You don't have to do that." And I said, "I know, but I want to." And he said, "Thank you, Diane." And I said, "Thank you for listening." And I went home and I thought about him more than I should have thought about his eyes and his voice and the way he'd seen me, really seen me. And I told myself it was nothing, that I was just lonely, that he was just kind. But I went back to that bar the next week and the week after, and it became a routine. Every Friday night, I'd stop in and Liam would be there. And we'd talk. And slowly I started telling him things I'd never told anyone, about how scared I was that I couldn't run the company without Robert, about how my adult daughter Emma barely spoke to me because she blamed me for working too much, about how some nights I'd stand in my closet and cry because I couldn't remember what it felt like to be touched. And Liam listened to all of it, and he never judged, never offered empty platitudes, just listened. And sometimes he'd say things like, "You're doing better than you think," or "Your daughter will come around. She just needs time." And his certainty, his faith in me started to matter. And one night, about 3 months in, I was at the bar, and Liam said, "I have something to tell you." And I said, "Okay." And he said, "I got offered a job at a hotel downtown, better pay, better hours, and I should take it, but..." And he stopped, and I said, "But what?" And he said, "But then I won't see you every Friday." And something in my chest tightened, and I said, "You should take the job, Liam. That's a good opportunity." And he said, "I know, but I'll miss our talks." And I said, "I'll miss them too." And he said, "Diane, can I ask you something?" And I said, "Sure." And he said, "Why do you come here every week?" And I said, "Because you're easy to talk to." And he said, "Is that the only reason?" And I looked at him, and I saw something in his eyes, something I'd been trying to ignore. And I said, "What other reason would there be?" And he said, "I don't know, you tell me." And I said, "Liam, I'm 53 years old." And he said, "I know." And I said, "You're 25. And he said, "I know." And I said, "Then you know why this conversation can't go where you want it to go." And he said, "All I know is that you're the most interesting person I've met in years, and I look forward to Friday nights more than anything else in my week, and I don't care about the age difference." And I said, "Well, I do." And he said, "Why?" And I said, "Because people would judge, because it would look inappropriate, because I'm supposed to be grieving my husband, not thinking about a bartender young enough to be my son." And he said, "Are you thinking about me?" And I didn't. And he said, "Diane," and I said, "Yes, okay, yes, I think about you, and I shouldn't, but I do." And he smiled and said, "Good." And I said, "It's not good, Liam, it's complicated." And he said, "Most good things are." And I said, "I can't do this." And he said, "Okay, but I need you to know that if you ever change your mind, I'm here." And I left that night, and I didn't go back for 3 weeks because I was scared. Scared of what I was feeling, scared of what people would say, scared of everything. And then one night I was at a company dinner at some overpriced restaurant, and I looked around at all these people in their suits and their practiced smiles, and I felt so profoundly alone that I excused myself, and I walked out, and I found myself walking those 3 blocks to that bar. And when I walked in, Liam was there, and he saw me, and his face lit up, and he said, "You came back." And I said, "I did." And he said, "Why?" And I said, "Because I missed you." And he said, "I missed you too." And I said, "Liam, I don't know what this is, or what it could be, but I need you to understand that if we do this, if we try this, it has to be private. No one can know." And he said, "Why?" And I said, "Because I have a reputation, a company, people who depend on me." And he said, "And you think being with me would damage that?" And I said, "Yes." And he said, "Okay, then we'll be careful." And I said, "Are you sure you want to do this? You could be with someone your own age, someone who..." And he said, "Diane, I don't want someone my own age. I want you." And the way he said, "It's so certain, so final," made something in me break open. And I said, "Okay." And he said, "Okay." And that night he came home with me to my huge empty house in the suburbs, and we sat in my kitchen and talked until sunrise, and nothing physical happened. We just talked, but it was more intimate than anything I'd experienced in years. And when he left in the morning, he kissed my cheek and said, "I'll call you." And he did. He called that afternoon, and we started seeing each other in secret. He'd come to my house late at night after his shift, and we'd watch movies and talk. And slowly, carefully, we started building something real. And one night, about a month in, we were on my couch, and I was telling him about a board meeting that had gone badly, and he was listening with his hand on my knee, and I stopped mid-sentence, and said, I need to tell you something. And he said, what? And I said, I'm falling for you, and I don't know what to do about it. And he said, you don't have to do anything, just let it happen. And I said, I'm scared. And he said, so am I, but I think this is worth being scared for. And then he kissed me, really kissed me. And it was gentle and deep, and I felt it everywhere. And when we broke apart, I said we shouldn't, and he said, probably not. And I said, I'm too old for you. And he said, you keep saying that, and I said, because it's true. And he said, Diane, age is just a number. And I said, that's easy to say when you're 25, and he said, and it's hard to believe when you're 53, but that doesn't make it less true. And I wanted to argue, but I couldn't, because he was right. And that night we made love for the first time, and it was terrifying and beautiful. And afterwards, lying in his arms, I said, what are we doing? And he said, we're living. And I said, but what if people find out? What if this ruins everything? And he said, then we'll deal with it, but I'm not going to live my life afraid of what people might think. And I said, I wish I had your courage. And he said, you do. You just forgot how to use it. And over the next 3 months, Liam became my whole world. He was the first person I thought about in the morning and the last person I talked to at night, and I fell completely desperately in love with him in a way I'd never loved. Robert, because with Robert, everything was partnership and strategy, but with Liam, everything was feeling and presence, and he made me laugh, and he made me feel young, and he made me feel like I was more than just a CEO or a widow. I was just Diane. That was enough, and I kept our relationship secret, I told. No one, not my assistant, not my friends, not my daughter. And Liam never complained. He understood the stakes, but I could see sometimes that it hurt him, that he wanted to hold my hand in public, wanted to introduce me to his friends, wanted to be acknowledged, and I felt guilty, but not guilty enough to change anything. And then 4 months into our relationship, everything fell apart. I was at a board meeting and my phone buzzed, and it was a text from a number I didn't recognize, and it said, thought you should know your boyfriend's ex-wife is telling everyone about you too. And I felt cold all over, and I excused myself, and I called Liam and said what happened, and he said, Melissa found out I've been seeing someone, and she's been asking around, and someone must have seen us and told her. And I said, what is she saying? And he said, she's saying I'm dating some rich older woman, and she's making it sound like I'm using you for money. And I said, are you? And he said, what? And I said, are you using me? And there was silence. And then he said, I can't believe you just asked me that. And I said, Liam, I need to know. And he said, Diane, I love you. I've told you that I don't care about your money. And I said, but how do I know? And he said, because I've never asked you for anything, because I pay for things when we go out, even though I know you could buy the entire restaurant, because I'm with you when no one's watching, when there's no benefit to me. And I said, I'm sorry, and he said, you just what? Don't trust me? And I said, I don't know. And he said, well, let me know when you figure it out. And he hung up, and I stood there shaking because I'd just destroyed the best thing in my life over paranoia and fear. And I tried calling him back, but he didn't answer. And I went back to the board meeting, and I couldn't focus. And afterwards, my COO, Richard, pulled me aside and said, Diane, is everything okay? And I said, yes, why? And he said, because there are rumors. And I said, what kind of rumors? And he said, rumors about you and someone much younger. And I said, it's none of anyone's business. And he said, actually, it is when it affects the company. And I said, how does my personal life affect the company? And he said, because people are questioning your judgment. And I said, my judgment? And he said, Diane, you're a 53-year-old widow dating a 25-year-old bartender, it looks. And I said, it looks like what Richard, like I'm finally living my life. And he said, it looks like you're having a crisis. And I said, maybe I am, but it's my crisis. And he said, not when you're the face of this company. And I walked away before I said something I'd regret, and I went home and I poured myself a drink. And I sat in the dark and I thought about everything Richard had said, and I knew he was right. The optics were bad, and people would judge, and it could hurt the company. And I thought about calling Liam and ending things, telling him it was for the best, but I couldn't, because the thought of not having him in my life was unbearable. And then my doorbell rang, and I opened it, and there was Liam, and he said, I'm sorry I hung up on you. And I said, I'm sorry I asked if you were using me. And he said, I get why you did. People have probably been using you your whole life. And I said, that's not an excuse. And he said, no, but it's a reason. And I said, Liam, people know about us. And he said, I know. And I said, it's going to get ugly. And he said, I know. And I said, you should probably walk away now before it gets worse. And he said, is that what you want? And I said, no, but it's what's smart. And he said, I don't care about smart, I care about you. And I said, Liam, be realistic, this is going to follow you. Everywhere Melissa is going to make your life hell. People are going to say terrible things about both of us. And he said, let them. And I said, you don't understand. And he said, then help me understand. And I said, I could lose everything, my reputation, everything I've built. And he said, and I could lose you, which is worse. And I started crying, and he held me and said, Diane, I'm not going anywhere unless you tell me to go. And I said, I don't want you to go. And he said, then I'm staying. And we stood there holding each other, and I felt something settle in my chest, like maybe this could work, like maybe love was enough. And if you're still watching this, tell me in the comments if you'd stay, or if you'd walk away because what happened next tested both of us in ways I never imagined. The next day I went to the office, and the whispers started. I could feel people looking at me differently, talking behind my back, and at lunch, my assistant Jenny came in and said, Mrs. Montgomery there. It's an article, and I said, what article? And she showed me her phone, and it was a gossip blog with the headline, Tech Widow's Toy Boy. And there was a photo of Liam and me leaving my house together, and the article was vicious. It called me desperate and pathetic. It called Liam a gold digger. It speculated about our sex life and suggested I was having a mental breakdown, and I read it and I felt sick, and I called our PR team and said, handle this, and they said, how? And I said, I don't care, make it go away. And they said, Mrs. Montgomery, the best thing to do is not respond, don't feed the story. And I said, fine. And I called Liam and said, did you see it? And he said, yes. And I said, I'm so sorry. And he said, why are you apologizing? And I said, because this is my fault. If I hadn't been so careless, if I'd been more careful. And he said, Diane, stop. This isn't your fault. And I said, it feels like my fault. And he said, well, it's not, and we'll get through this. And I said, how? And he said, together. And that word together made me want to cry, because I'd been doing everything alone for so long. I'd forgotten what together felt like. And that night, Liam came over, and we didn't talk about the article. We just cooked dinner together and watched a movie and pretended everything was normal. And for a few hours it was. But the next morning my daughter Emma called and said, Mom, what the hell? And I said, Emma. And she said, I just read an article about you dating some bartender who's younger than me. And I said, it's not like that. And she said, then what is it like? And I said, I'm in a relationship, Emma. And she said, with a 25-year-old? And I said, yes. And she said, Mom, this is insane. What are you thinking? And I said, I'm thinking I'm happy for the first time in 3 years. And she said, you're not happy, you're having a breakdown. And I said, Emma, that's not fair. And she said, what's not fair? Is you embarrassing Dad's memory like this? And I said, your father is dead, Emma. And she said, I know that, Mom, I was at his funeral, remember? And I said, then you know that I'm allowed to move on. And she said, not like this, not with someone half your age. And I said, Emma, I love him. And she said, you don't love him, Mom, you're lonely, and he's taking advantage of that. And I said, he's not taking advantage. And she said, how do you know? And I said, because I know him. And she said, you've known him for what? 4 months, 5 months, that's not enough time. And I said, it's enough for me. And she said, Mom, if you do this, if you stay with him, I can't support it. And I said, are you giving me an ultimatum? And she said, I'm telling you how I feel. And I said, okay. Then I guess we don't have anything else to talk about. And I hung up, and I cried, because my daughter, the only family I had left, had just chosen judgment over support. And Liam held me and said, she'll come around. And I said, you don't know that. And he said, no, but I have to believe it, because I can't stand seeing you hurt like this. And I said, I'm okay. And he said, no, you're not, and that's okay. You don't have to be okay right now. And I loved him so much in that moment for seeing me, for not trying to fix it, just for being there. And the next week was hell. The board called a special meeting, and they said, Diane, we need to. Your relationship. And I said, there's nothing to discuss. And Thomas, the board chairman, said, actually, there is, when it affects shareholder confidence. And I said, how does my personal life affect shareholder confidence? And he said, when you're in the tabloids being called a cougar, and your judgment is being questioned. It affects everything." And I said, "So what do you want me to do?" And he said, "We want you to end the relationship." And I said, "No." And he said, "Diane, be reasonable." And I said, "I am." "Being reasonable, you're asking me to end a relationship with someone I love because of optics." And Thomas said, "Yes, because optics matter in business." And I said, "Not to me." And he said, "Then maybe you're not the right person to lead this company anymore." And I said, "Are you threatening to remove me?" And he said, "I'm saying that if you continue this relationship, there will be consequences." And I said, "Then I guess there will be consequences." And I walked out and I called Liam and said, "They want me to choose between you and the company." And he said, "What are you going to do?" And I said, "I don't know." And he said, "Diane, I would never ask you to give up your company for me." And I said, "I know, but I don't know if I can give you up either." And he said, "Then don't." And I said, "It's not that simple." And he said, "Yes, it is. You choose what matters more." And I said, "You both matter." And he said, "Okay, then choose both." And I said, "How?" And he said, "I don't know, but we'll figure it out." And that night I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about everything I'd built, about the company Robert and I had started, about the thousands of employees who depended on me. And I thought about Liam, about how he made me feel, about how he'd stood by me when everyone else had judged, and I didn't know what to do. And then 2 days later, Liam called and said, "Melissa wants to meet." And I said, "What?" And he said, "She texted me, she wants to talk." And I said, "About what?" And he said, "I don't know, but I think I should go." And I said, "Why?" And he said, "Because maybe if I talk to her, she'll stop spreading rumors." And I said, "Liam, I don't think that's a good idea." And he said, "I have to try." And I said, "Okay, but be careful." And he said, "I will." And that afternoon, Liam met Melissa at a coffee shop. And I waited at home anxious. And when he came back 2 hours later, his face was pale. And I said, "What happened?" And he said, "She offered me money." And I said, "What?" And he said, "She said, if I break up with you, she'll give me $50,000. And I said, "Why would she do that?" And he said, "Because she wants to humiliate you. She wants people to think I was only with you for money. And when I leave and take a payout, it'll prove her right." And I said, "What did you say?" And he said, "I told her to go to hell." And I said, "Liam," and he said, "Diane, I'm not leaving you for money. I'm not leaving you at all." And I said, "But $50,000 is a lot of money." And he said, "Not as much as you're worth." And I kissed him hard and said, "I love you." And he said, "I love you too." And we held each other, and I thought maybe we could survive this. Maybe love really was enough. And then 3 days later, everything came to a head. I got invited to a charity gala, one of those events where the city's elite gathered to throw money at causes and feel good about themselves. And normally I wouldn't go, but this year, the charity was one Robert had cared about. And I felt obligated, and I asked Liam if he wanted to come, and he said, "Are you sure?" And I said, "Yes, I'm tired of hiding." And he said, "Okay." And the night of the gala, I wore my Valentino gown, and Liam wore a rented tux, and he looked so handsome and nervous. And we drove to the event, and when we walked in together, people stared and whispered, and I held my head high, and I held Liam's hand, and I didn't care what anyone thought. And we were standing by the bar when I saw her, Melissa, Liam's ex-wife, wearing a dress that cost more than most people's rent on the arm of some man in an expensive suit, and she saw us and her, lit up with malice, and she walked over and said, well, if it isn't Liam and his sugar mama." And I said, "Excuse me." And she said, "Oh, I'm sorry. Am I being rude? I just think it's funny that Liam went from not being able to afford me to dating someone who could buy me." And Liam said, "Melissa, don't." And she said, "Don't what? Tell the truth." And she turned to me and said, "He's using you right. He doesn't love you. He just loves your bank account." And I said, "That's not true." And she laughed and said, "Honey, you're what, 55, 60, and he's 25. What exactly do you think he sees in you?" And I said, "Maybe he sees someone who treats him with respect." And she said, "Or maybe he sees an easy target, a lonely widow who's so desperate for attention she'll believe anything." And Liam said, "That's enough." And she said, "Is it because I'm just getting started?" And she looked around at the crowd that had gathered and said, "Everyone should know that this woman is paying my ex-husband to pretend to love her." And I said, "I'm not paying him." And she said, "Really? So he's with you because you're young and beautiful? Oh, wait." And the crowd laughed, and I felt humiliation wash over me. And Liam said, Melissa, stop. And she said, why you couldn't even afford to take me to a decent restaurant when we were married. And now you're living in her mansion, driving her cars. And he said, I'm not living in her house. I have my own apartment and I pay my own bills. And she said, sure you do. And I felt Liam tense next to me. And I knew he was about to say something he'd regret. And that's when I stepped forward and I said, excuse me. And Melissa turned to me and said, can I help you? And I said, yes, you can stop talking to my boyfriend like that. And the room went completely silent. And Melissa said, your boyfriend. And I said, yes, my boyfriend. And if you ever speak to him like that again, you'll be hearing from my lawyers. And Melissa's face went red. And she said, you can't threaten me. And I said, that wasn't a threat, that was a promise. And I turned to the crowd and said, Liam and I are in a relationship, a real relationship, built on love and respect. And if any of you have a problem with that, you can take it up with me directly because I'm done hiding and I'm done apologizing for being happy. And I looked at Liam and said, let's go. And we walked out of that gala with everyone staring. And when we got to the car, Liam said, that was amazing. And I said, was it? And he said, yes. You just told everyone you loved me. And I said, I did. And he said, why? And I said, because I'm tired of being afraid and because you're worth fighting for. And he kissed me right there in the parking lot in front of anyone who might be watching and said, I love you, Diane. Montgomery and I said, I love you too. And the next day, the gossip sites exploded with headlines about my public declaration. And the board called an emergency meeting. And Thomas said, Diane, what were you thinking? And I said, I was thinking, I'm done letting you control my personal life. And he said, we're not trying to control your personal life, we're trying to protect the company. And I said, by asking me to hide who I love, and he said, yes, if necessary. And I said, then I quit, and the room went silent. And Thomas said, what? And I said, I quit effective immediately. And he said, Diane, you can't quit. You built this company. And I said, and now I'm leaving it because I'm not going to sacrifice my happiness for a board that doesn't value me as a person, only as a figurehead. And Thomas said, we value you. And I said, no, you don't. If you valued me, you'd support me instead of judging me. And I stood up and I walked out and I called Liam and said, I just quit. And he said, what? And I said, I quit my job. And he said, because of me. And I said, no, because of me, because I finally realized that the company doesn't define me and I'd rather have you and my dignity than a job that requires me to hide who I am. And he said, Diane, are you sure? And I said, I've been more sure of anything. And he said, I love you. And I said, I love you too. And that night we celebrated at my house, just the two of us. And Liam said, what are you going to do now? And I said, I don't know. Maybe I'll start my own company, maybe. I'll consult, maybe I'll take a year off and actually live. And he said, whatever you decide, I'm here. And I said, I know. And that is everything. And the next few months were strange. I'd spent 30 years building my career, and suddenly I didn't have one. And at first I felt lost, but then I started to feel free. I started sleeping past 6 a.m. I started reading books for pleasure. I started going to the gym and cooking dinner and spending time with Liam without constantly checking my phone. And slowly, I started to figure out who I was outside of work, and I started consulting for startups, helping them build operations and strategy, and I was good at it, and I didn't have to answer to a board or worry about shareholders. I just did the work, and it was satisfying. And Liam and I moved in together into a smaller house, one that felt like ours, not mine, and we built a life together. And people still judged. People still whispered. But I didn't care because I was happy, genuinely happy, in a way I'd never been. And then, 6 months after I quit, Emma called and said, Mom, can we talk? And I said, of course. And she said, I'm sorry. And I said, for what? And she said, for judging you, for not supporting you. I've been thinking about what you said about Dad being gone and you being allowed to move on. And you're right. And I said, thank you. And she said, can I meet him? And I said, Liam. She said, yes, I want to meet the man who made my mom happy again. And I started crying and said, yes, of course. And a week later, Emma came to visit and she met Liam, and they talked for hours about books and music and life. And afterwards, she pulled me aside and said, Mom, I get it. And I said, get what? And she said, why you love him. He's kind and smart. And he looks at you like you're the most important person in the world. And I said, he makes me feel that way. And she said, good. You deserve that. And I hugged Her and I felt something heal inside me, and now it's been 2 years since that night in the bar when I met Liam. 2 years. Since he saw me, really saw me, and chose to stay. And we're still together, still happy, still building our life. And yes, there is an age gap. And yes, people still judge, but I don't care because I learned that life is too short to live for other people. Is approval, and Liam taught me that love doesn't have an age limit, and happiness doesn't have rules, and the best things in life are often the ones that scare you most. And I'm 55 now and he's 27 and we're talking about getting married, and when people ask me if I'm worried about the future, if I'm worried about what happens when I'm 70, and he's 42. I say no because I learned to stop borrowing trouble from the future and to be present in the now. And right now I'm happy and that's enough. And if you're watching this and you've ever been told you're too old or too young or too anything to be happy, I want you to know that's a lie, because happiness doesn't have requirements. It just is, and you deserve it regardless of what anyone else thinks. And Liam showed up for me when no one else would. He saw me when I was invisible. He loved me when I thought I was unlovable. And that night at the gala when I stood up for him in front of everyone, it wasn't just about defending him, it was about choosing myself, about choosing love over fear and reputation and security. And it was the scariest and best decision I ever made, because it gave me my life back. And if this story touched you, if it made you think about your own life and the choices you're making, leave a comment and tell me what you would choose and share this with someone who needs to hear that it's never too late to start over, and it's never too late to be loved exactly as you are.